This is the kind of history they don't teach in school. Subscribe and be part of the ones who know. 80 skeletons, 6 coastal towns, spread across what are now Kenya and Tanzania. Burials dated between 1250 and 1800 AD, pulled from stone-built settlements that once ran a trade network stretching from the Indian Ocean monsoon coast to the interior of Africa. In 2023, a team of geneticists sequenced the DNA from those bones and published the results in the journal Nature. What they found didn't just confirm an old story. It confirmed one detail so precisely that it startled the researchers who found it. The story goes back centuries, told long before anyone had the tools to check it. 7 princes, fleeing a homeland in Persia. 7 ships. 7 towns founded along a stretch of East African coastline, each one a seed of a new civilization built from stone, trade, and a new religion. Generations passed the story down as oral history. Not proven, not disproven, just carried. A founding myth, the kind every old culture keeps somewhere in its collective memory. Filed under, probably exaggerated. Except the DNA didn't exaggerate it. It sharpened it. Researchers didn't just find vague evidence of contact between Africa and Asia somewhere on this coast. At some point in the past, they found a date. They found a direction. They found which parent came from where, how many generations back, and roughly when the first children were born who could claim ancestry from both worlds. The legend said sometime long ago from Persia. The genome said something far more specific and far stranger. Now go 1,500 miles away from that coastline. Go inland, north, into an arid basin near a lake most outsiders have never heard of. There, buried under stone pillars older than the pyramids of Giza are old, sits a monumental cemetery, one of the oldest built by any herding society on the planet. No stone towns here, no trade goods from across an ocean. Just herders, cattle, and monuments raised by people archaeologists still argue about. And the DNA from that site tells a story that doesn't just differ from the coastal story. It undercuts the entire premise beneath both of them. The idea that any group in this country has ever really counted as the original one. So here's the question worth sitting with before either story gets resolved. If Kenya's most foreign-looking community, the Islamic, Persian-influenced Swahili coast, turns out to have an oral history that matches its own DNA almost exactly, which of Kenya's supposedly indigenous, untouched interior tribes turns out to have the shakier claim to being original? To understand why that question even makes sense, you need the textbook version first. The version taught in Kenyan schools, printed in tourist guidebooks, and repeated at every cultural festival in Nairobi. Kenya is home to more than 40 recognized ethnic groups, and for over a century now, anthropologists and colonial administrators alike have sorted nearly all of them into 3 broad linguistic families. First, the Bantu speakers, the Kikuyu, Luhya, Kamba, Meru, and Mijikenda among them, who make up roughly 65% of the national population. Their ancestors, according to the standard account, spread out of West and Central Africa in one of history's largest and slowest migrations, the Bantu expansion, arriving in East Africa somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. Second, the Nilotic speakers, the Luo, the Maasai, the Kalenjin, the Turkana, the Samburu, pastoralist and semi-pastoralist peoples whose languages trace back toward the Nile Valley and what is now South Sudan. Third, the Cushitic speakers, Somali, Borana, Rendile, Orma, herding communities whose linguistic roots reach into the Horn of Africa and the Ethiopian highlands. Then there's the coast, which gets treated almost as its own separate chapter. The Swahili, technically Bantu-speaking by language but culturally distinct, absorbed centuries of Indian Ocean trade contact with Arab and Persian merchants, and out of that contact came the Swahili language, the spread of Islam, and the coral stone towns that still stand today. Its founding story, again, traces back to the Kilwa Chronicle and its tale of Shirazi princes crossing the sea. Here is the assumption baked into all of it, rarely said out loud but treated as fact. Each of these groups' modern identity functions as a stand-in for an ancient, distinct bloodline. Kikuyu blood, Maasai blood, Swahili blood, each one arriving in its own discrete wave, settling its own territory and staying, more or less, genetically separate ever since. Colonial-era census categories hardened this idea into policy. Post-independence politics inherited it. Tribe, in the way most Kenyans have been taught to understand it, is treated as fixed ancestry, not fluid affiliation. And if that assumption holds, there's a clean, predictable ranking that should follow from it. The Swahili coast, soaked in centuries of Arab and Persian contact, should turn out to be the most genetically mixed, least purely African community in the country. And the interior pastoralist tribes, isolated by geography and, supposedly, by choice, should turn out to be the cleanest, oldest, least diluted lineages in Kenya. That ranking is exactly what the DNA does not deliver. Here is where it gets complicated. The 2023 Nature study, led by Esther Brielle, a geneticist working out of the Reich Lab at Harvard, alongside co-first authors Stephanie Wynne-Jones of the University of York and Jeffrey Fleischer of Rice University, with Rice archaeologist Mary Prendergast also on the senior author list, sequenced ancient genomes from those 80 coastal skeletons. 6 medieval and early modern towns. 1 additional inland Kenyan settlement occupied after 1650. The title of the paper says almost everything. Entwined African and Asian genetic roots of medieval peoples of the Swahili coast. What they found, in many of these individuals, more than half of their total DNA traced back to African ancestors, and the majority of those African ancestors, tracked through the maternal line, were women. But a large proportion of the remaining DNA, in some individuals more than half, traced to Asian ancestors. Not vaguely Asian. Specifically, 80 to 90% of that Asian portion came from Persia, the rest from India. Think of it like a ledger passed down through the generations, one that keeps a running tally of exactly which ancestors contributed which portion of your genetic makeup. Not opinions, not stories, just proportions, written into every cell of the body. That's what a genome effectively is. An inherited accounting record nobody can rewrite after the fact. And the timing on that ledger was almost eerie in its precision. The African-Asian mixing didn't begin in some vague, long ago. It began around 1000 AD, a date that lines up almost exactly with the large-scale local adoption of Islam along this coast. Not decades apart, not close enough to be coincidence, according to the researchers, the same window. Then, after roughly 1500 AD, the source of that Asian ancestry shifts, less Persian, more Arabian, which tracks with a well-documented rise in trade and settlement contact from southern Arabia in the same period, the genetic record and the historical record moving in lockstep, decades apart at most, and the pattern carries a gendered signature that repeats, generation after generation. African mothers, Asian fathers, children who kept their mother's language and their mother's matrilineal customs, even while their fathers introduced an entirely new patriarchal religion into the household. Continuity through the women, disruption through the men, over and over, in town after town. Clean, specific, almost exactly what the legend claimed, not by decades, by nearly the exact year. But here's the mini twist buried inside that same paper. The part that complicates even this tidy match between legend and genome. This wasn't one single founding event. Brielle's team found the same African-Asian mixing pattern happening independently at multiple separate points, spread across hundreds of miles of coastline, at least 2 locations, in the researchers' own words, and possibly even more. The old story imagines 7 princes landing at 7 towns in one coordinated founding wave. The genetics suggests something messier. Repeated, independent, unconnected instances of the same kind of mixing, happening again and again up and down the coast, over centuries, not all at once. The consensus story wasn't wrong, it was just too simple, and too singular, for what actually happened. So what does the mainstream explanation actually say, once all of this is on the table? The first theory says exactly what the legend always said, just with better resolution. The Swahili coast is a genuine, documentable hybrid culture. And the DNA doesn't just loosely support the oral history, it validates it, almost point for point. Fleischer, as senior author on the study, has pointed directly to that 1000 AD mixing date as matching the archaeological record of religious and cultural change on the coast almost precisely. The numbers back it up. That initial wave of intermixing skews roughly 90% Persian male-derived ancestry, against roughly 10% Indian female-derived, which, worth pausing on, flips the more familiar colonial-era pattern of outsider men marrying into local populations into something more specific and considerably stranger than most people assume when they hear trade contact. Researchers are careful to frame all of this as probability, not certainty. Ancient DNA sampling captures individuals, not entire populations, and 80 skeletons across 6 towns is a snapshot, not a census. But even with that caveat built in, the first theory has a real limitation, and it's a big one. It only accounts for the coast. It says nothing at all, about how mixed, or how pure, the interior tribes of Kenya actually are. And it leaves an even stranger problem sitting there, unresolved. Some Kenyans who identify as Swahili today, when their DNA was checked against the medieval individuals in this very study, turned out to be genetically very different from those ancient ancestors, while others, elsewhere along the coast, retain substantial medieval ancestry. Identity and ancestry have already come apart measurably within the single best documented ethnic group in the entire country, which leaves the coast story looking almost suspiciously tidy by comparison to what's coming next. Recent, well-documented, practically yesterday on a genetic timescale. But 1,500 miles north, buried in a basin most Kenyans have never visited, there is an older, murkier layer of admixture, one that doesn't stop at the coast, doesn't stop at any single tribe, and runs quietly through nearly every ethnic group in the country, regardless of religion, regardless of language, regardless of how indigenous or how foreign that group has always assumed itself to be. And it happened roughly 4,000 years before the first Persian ship ever touched this shore, before there was a Kilwa Chronicle, before there was a mosque built on this coast, before there was a single word of Arabic carved into coral stone, before there was Islam here at all. There was a lake, and a cemetery built by people archaeologists still cannot fully explain. The second theory doesn't compete with the first one so much as it reaches underneath it. In 2019, a team led by Mary Prendergast of Rice University, with Mark Lipson and Elizabeth Sawchuk as co-first authors and geneticist David Reich again anchoring the analysis, published a genome-wide study in the journal Science. Its subject wasn't the coast, it was the interior. Specifically, 41 individuals recovered from later Stone Age, pastoral Neolithic, and Iron Age sites across what's now Kenya and Tanzania. Their finding, livestock herding, sheep, goats, cattle, entered sub-Saharan Africa roughly 5,000 years ago, not gradually drifting in from everywhere at once, entering through a specific door, the likely point of entry, the Turkana Basin, in Kenya's arid north, where domesticated animals show up in the archaeological record before farming ever does. What happened next is the part that matters. Migrants carrying ancestry, linked to northeastern Africa, mixed with local Eastern African foraging populations already living around that basin. Out of that mixing came several new pastoralist populations, including one the researchers describe as genetically homogeneous, a tightly clustered group they call the pastoral Neolithic population. Run the numbers on that cluster, and roughly 74.5% of its ancestry, plus or minus 1 percentage point, traces directly back to that northeastern related source. Think of ancestry proportions like this less as a fixed inheritance and more like sediment settling in a riverbed. Each new wave of migration doesn't wash the old layers away, it just deposits another one on top, and what you dig up depends entirely on how deep you go. Sawchuk, one of the study's co-first authors, put it plainly. East Africa's genetic, linguistic, and cultural diversity has roots reaching back several millennia. Not decades, not centuries, millennia. Here's where the theory runs into its own limits, and where it starts working against the tidy version of the story laid out earlier. This wasn't a single clean mixing event either. The same basin absorbed additional admixture from both northeastern and western African-related groups again, later, during the Iron Age. Layer on layer, wave on wave. And more damaging to the old tribal framework than that, these ancient genetic clusters do not sort neatly into today's Nilotic, Cushitic, and Bantu linguistic categories. Populations that speak completely unrelated languages today turn out to share this same deep ancestral layer. Populations that speak closely related languages and consider themselves close kin sometimes don't. This is where it gets complicated in a way the coastal story never had to reckon with. If deep, foreign-sourced admixture runs through every part of Kenya's family tree 4,000 years before the first Persian trader ever set foot on this coast, then the coast was never uniquely impure, and the interior, the pastoralist tribes long assumed to be the untouched original Kenyans, was never uniquely pure either. There is no clean baseline anywhere in this country, no unmixed starting point to measure anyone else against. Every group everyone has ever pointed to as the real Kenyans turns out to be standing on the same layered, borrowed ground as everyone they were being compared to. The third theory, and it's the one most researchers are visibly hesitant to say out loud in plain terms, starts at the same basin but goes further than the genetics alone can currently support. In 2018, archaeologist Elizabeth Hildebrand and her colleagues published findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on a site called Lothagam North, a pillar site near Lake Turkana, roughly 5,000 years old, built evidently by early herders, and built as a monument, a genuine monument, with large basalt pillars hauled and raised over what became hundreds of burials. That alone is strange enough to sit with. Monumental construction, in most of the archaeological record, tracks with settled societies and social hierarchy. Chiefs, elites, people worth building something permanent for. But Lothagam North doesn't sort that way. Men, women, children, ornamented burials and plain ones, all mixed together with no clear separation by rank or status. Mobile herders, no apparent ruling class, and yet a monument. Some researchers read this as exactly what it looks like, a mobile, relatively egalitarian people building something permanent specifically because the world around them was changing fast, unpredictably, and they needed an anchor, not a monument to power, but a monument against instability. A marker planted in the ground that said, in effect, we were here, regardless of what happens next. But there's a more speculative thread running underneath even that reading, and it needs to be flagged clearly as unsettled. A handful of geneticists working with this data have raised the possibility that the northeastern African-related ancestry showing up again and again in these Kenyan genomes doesn't trace cleanly back to any population scientists have directly sampled yet. That there may be an additional source population, still unrecovered, still genetically invisible, sitting somewhere upstream of everything Prendergast's team was able to measure. This is not a settled finding. It's an open question, argued over inside the same research community that agrees, without dispute, on the raw DNA itself. Who built Lothagam North and exactly where every strand of their ancestry actually came from remains unresolved, argued over by the very scientists who agree on almost everything else. Go back to the coast now. Not as a chart, not as a percentage, as a place. You are standing on Manda Island, or somewhere very much like it, sometime around the year 1000. The house around you is built from coral rag, blocks cut from the reef itself, still being fitted into walls that will, centuries later, still be standing when archaeologists come to excavate them. Outside, a dhow is working its way in on the monsoon wind, the same seasonal wind pattern that has carried traders across this stretch of the Indian Ocean for generations, and will keep carrying them for centuries more. Somewhere nearby, a merchant is scratching Arabic script into a ledger or a doorframe, right alongside a Bantu language that's been spoken on this coast for 1,000 years already. Inside the house, a child is listening to her mother, not her father. The language filling that room, the one this child will grow up speaking without a second thought, is her mother's. The coastal Bantu tongue that will eventually become Swahili. Her father, meanwhile, has brought a new religion into the household, one that will reshape how this family marries, buries its dead, and organizes its community for the rest of its existence here. Two inheritances, moving down two completely different lines, in the same house, at the same time. Standing there, you would have had no way of knowing you were standing at a hinge point. You couldn't have known that oral historians would spend the next 1,000 years turning this exact kind of household into legend. 7 princes, 7 ships. Or that geneticists, 1,000 years later, would recover fragments of bone from people very much like you and prove that legend almost exactly right, down to the ratio of Persian to Indian ancestry, down to the decade the mixing began. Here is the reframe that all 3 of these threads have been quietly building toward, and it's bigger than either twist on its own. Kenyan, in the ethnic sense most people still use the word, as shorthand for tribe, and tribe as shorthand for ancient, unbroken bloodline, never existed the way the census categories imply. What actually exists, according to every genome recovered so far, is a stack of overlapping admixture events, laid down at wildly different points on the timeline. Forager populations first, then northeastern pastoralist migrants, arriving roughly 5,000 years ago, then Bantu-speaking farmers, spreading through the region 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, then Persian and Indian traders on the coast, roughly 1,000 years ago, then Arabian traders, around 500 years ago, then, later still, waves of South Asian labor migration brought in under British colonial railway construction, another layer, more recent, no less real. Every group commonly treated as indigenous and untouched, the interior pastoralist and farming tribes, the ones assumed to be Kenya's cleanest lineages, carries the exact same kind of deep, layered admixture history as the group most often singled out as foreign, the Swahili coast. The only real difference between them isn't purity, it's timing and visibility, and how neatly the mixing happens to match a story a community already tells about itself. And that mismatch cuts deepest exactly where the evidence is best. Remember, some Kenyans who identify as Swahili today turned out, when checked against the actual medieval individuals in Brielle's study, to be genetically very different from those ancient ancestors. Others retained substantial medieval ancestry. Identity and ancestry had already drifted apart measurably within a single generation's worth of sampling, in the one case where scientists actually had the bones to check. If that's happening in the best documented population in the country, there is no reason to assume it isn't happening, quietly, unproven, everywhere else too. Not by legend, by ledger. The uncomfortable implication sits underneath all of it. Tribe, in the way modern Kenya still uses the word, functions as a category built on selective memory, not on lineage. It's a real social fact, a real political fact. People organize their lives, their marriages, their loyalties, and their votes around it. But it was never, strictly speaking, a biological record of who came from where. It only ever looked like one. None of this is unique to Kenya, and it's worth being honest about that before drawing any conclusion at all. Every population on Earth that's been put through this kind of ancient DNA analysis, in Britain, in Iberia, across the Balkans, in Japan, has turned out to be the same kind of thing. A layered composite, not a clean lineage. Kenya isn't an exception. It's simply one of the best documented cases because two major, high-profile studies happen to bracket its history from opposite ends of the timeline. One anchored 5,000 years ago at a lake in the north, the other anchored 1,000 years ago on a coastline in the east. Researchers studying both sites are careful, still, to frame their conclusions as probability rather than certainty. Ancient DNA works from the individuals archaeologists happen to recover, not from a full census of the dead. But even with that caution built in, one description keeps surfacing across interviews with the scientists behind both papers, almost as a shared instinct, that studying a population's DNA is a little like restoring an old photograph, layer by layer, only to find that underneath the top image someone painted decades ago, there are several other images already there, each one painted over the last, none of them fake, all of them real, none of them the original the family always assumed was underneath. None of this erases what tribe, language, and coastal identity mean to the people who live inside them in Kenya today. Those things are lived, they're real, in every way that matters day to day. What the genetics does is something quieter and, in its own way, more unsettling. It proves that none of those categories were ever simply a record of blood in the first place. They were stories, built on top of a much messier archive that nobody had the tools to read until now. The Kenyans were never who we thought, and the closer the DNA is read, the harder it becomes to say, with any confidence, who was.